Yes, I see Professor Hasim is here, but it's afternoon here. Good afternoon,
Hi,
Shireen.
yes, I'm here.
Hey, hi, Shireen. How are you?
Hi.
You know what happened to us 2 weeks ago. I mean, so we do worry about speakers now.
Maybe let's start. Let's start. Oh, thank you so much, and welcome all of you to this 60th seminar in our series of monthly seminars on the theme of the changing African idea of Africa and the future of African studies. These seminars are part of a collaborative effort by my chair here at the chair in epistemologies of the Global South here at the University of Bayreuth, together with the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study at the University of Johannesburg. We conceived these seminars as signature events that advance thinking on Africa and African studies. And today we are very privileged and honored to host Professor Shireen Hasim, who is Canada 150 Research Chair in Gender and African Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa in Canada, and a visiting professor at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research, WISA, at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. Professor Shireen, welcome. Professor Hasim is a leading scholar in feminist theory and politics, a collective action and the histories of mobilization of women, as well as social policy and gender. And some of her publications include No Shortcuts to Power, Women Policymaking in Africa, Women's Organization and Democracy, Contesting Authority, and the others, such as the edited volume of Go Home or Die Here, Violence, Xenophobia, and the Politics of Difference in South Africa. Professor Hasim will address us for a maximum of 60 minutes on the topic of genealogies of feminism in Africa. And then after that, my colleague, Dr. Bongani Ngolunga, will chair the Q&A session. For my part, I think now I have nothing else but to call upon Professor Hasim to deliver the seminar. Thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sabelo, and thank you, Bongani, both of you, for thinking of me and including me in this this really interesting series, which I've been following as we go along. And I feel slightly tentative and nervous to be making a presentation, given the quality of previous events in the series. So. But anyway, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm grateful to be here. I want to make a presentation that that in a way, is provocative, but also I hope that you will see as open-ended and as inviting debate and discussion. So if I have pushed certain ideas too far, I trust that this audience will definitely hold me to some theoretical and political account. Mm-hmm. When I was invited to be part of the series and I was thinking of a title, I turned to a word that I'm increasingly using in my work, and that's the word genealogies, as a way of thinking about the histories of intellectual thought. For me, this is a very purposeful choice. Using the word genealogies is a purposeful choice because what I want to signal is that there are roots or lines of theoretical descent that are deep within African imaginaries and politics. And I want to make an argument here for thinking about feminism as being indigenous to African theory and political practice. By indigenous, what do I mean? I mean that it has independent origins, that it is produced in forms that are distinctive to the places in which these ideas arose, right? So I'm using indigenous in that sense. And by saying genealogies rather than genealogy, using the plural, I also want to signal that there isn't a singular variant of feminism that we can call African feminism that crosses all countries and all women's movements in Africa. But rather, I want to work with the idea that there is richness, that there's a diverse set of expressions and idioms that may at times overlap with each other in the African continent, but also overlap with theorizing and activism elsewhere outside of Africa, and that appear quite different to each other sometimes in the power relations that they seek to understand and the power relations that they seek to resist. So really what I'm not, if you were hoping that what I was going to do was offer a distinctive set of characteristics or a list of 10 defining features of African feminism, I'm not going to do that. And we can argue maybe usefully about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing to do that, okay? But what I'm trying to do here, what I'm trying to do in this project and in the project, a larger project I'm working on, is to actually push against the approach of defining features of African feminism, to encourage us to think about the ways in which feminisms in Africa are always in conversation across the continent as well as across the world, and that these conversations, in whatever spaces they take place, are formative to theorization in many places. And controversially, Sabelo, I know you're going to pull me up on this, but feel free. I want to trouble in this talk the North versus South narrative as something that I think is an over-determining frame for thinking about bodies of feminist thought, right? Because it seems to me that the framing of North or West, sometimes we use North and West as if they were co-equivalent terms, that this North versus South or West versus South way of thinking about epistemology, this way of thinking about how ideas are made and formed, obscures more than it illuminates. So just to go back to the point that African feminisms are diverse, and just as they are diverse, I want to say so are Western feminisms diverse. And by thinking simply in dialectical terms, we create homogenizing binaries that are problematic. And why are they problematic? I think in particular, they do two harms to our thinking. The first is that I think that kind of North-South way of thinking about epistemology erases the impacts on feminism of the life worlds and critical theories of those who are at the margins of capitalism in all kinds of spaces in the world, of Black and working class feminisms in the North. And Jennifer Nash has shown us this so clearly in her book on feminism in the United States, that to characterize Western feminism as only white feminism is to erase a whole range of life worlds and a whole range of ways of making sense of slavery and capitalism and colonialism. So I'll come back to that point later. The second way in which I think it does a bit of harm, I think, is that it makes opaque the ways in which our feminisms in the global South, anti-colonial feminisms, have impacted the pathways of feminisms in the North, right? How we, in our struggles, our ways of thinking about what it is that we aspire to, our engagements with the inequities and harms of colonialism and capitalism, have also impacted on the ways in which feminism developed in the North, and have created new kinds of alliances and new ways of thinking elsewhere. So we disable our impact by thinking that, there's something here that's always been obscured. In a way, I could gesture, for example, to socialist feminism. That was the scene of internationalist radical thinking in which African feminists were hugely important, thinking about the ways in which experimentations in places like Mozambique, for example, in the liberated zones, under Frelimo were beginning to think about new forms of sociability, new ways of living together, of how we would reorganize in an emancipated world our social relations, right? And in doing that, the conversations and the influences in African socialist thinking, socialist feminist thinking, drew on what was happening in Vietnam, drew on what was happening in Cuba, in the Soviet Union, in socialist countries. So there's a whole range of conversations and impacts, mutual constitutions that have been erased by using the dichotomous notion of North versus South. So, of course, and I'm to be sure here we must acknowledge that those relations are always rooted in asymmetric power. And those of us who are academics, we have felt that asymmetry in epistemological production very keenly, right? In the circulatory networks of journals, conferences, and funding trajectories. But I want to say African feminists and feminisms have long been in Northern academies and in Northern non-academic political spaces, and their dissident voices against mainstream theoretical forms and political impositions have found allies and shaped new forms of thinking. Whatever you may think, for example, of the specificities of the Beijing Platform for Action, it would not be conceivable to have such a document as the Beijing Platform without the ideas and activism of feminists from the Global South. So in other words, what I want to say is that African feminism has been part of world making. And I want to argue today that African feminist bodies of thought both challenge and exceed nationalisms. So I just want to proceed from a slightly different starting point than some of the conversations in the series of talks. And we can engage whether that's productive or not, but I want us to do that. Okay, so I want to invite today, what I want to do is to invite us to think more deeply about the grammars of feminisms in Africa. I'm not a philosopher. My thinking proceeds differently from the philosophers among us in a way that is historically and politically rooted. So I approach any kind of intellectual mapping with the question, what social and political work do these concepts do? What are the roots of these ideas in the lives and practices of people? How will we find this out, right? Where will we find these grammars? How will we begin to trace the genealogies, these lines of connectivity across time and movements? To trace those ideas in feminism, I think we need to step outside of the archives of national institutions. We have to step outside the valorized histories of anti-colonial movements. And we also have to step outside the valorized histories of women's movements themselves, right? And by valorized, I mean the ones that are celebrated and officially accepted and find their expression in things like Women's Day in South Africa. So we need to take very seriously a range of other archives from below. And this, it seems to me, is a deeply feminist practice anyway, long-standing feminist practice. I'm not saying anything new when I say this. This is really what feminist tries to do. It takes seriously songs and pamphlets and weddings and funerals. And even as Sylvia Tamale has reminded us, it takes very seriously the archives of secrets and silences. As paradoxically, you may think of those as spaces of absence, but actually they're spaces in which a lot of work is being done. What is brought forward, what is kept away, from whose gaze are they being kept away, right? So in Sylvia Tamale's amazing work on the sexual secrets of the Baganda, she shows how, in order to close off the colonial pathological gaze on African people's sexualities, a whole range of practices were kept within closed conversations. So that's what I mean by archives of secrets and silences. So we need to shift our gaze beyond the fixed points of liberation movements. And again, to borrow a phrase from another amazing African feminist, Freni Ginwala, we need to listen with big elephant ears, big ears, right? So thinking this way, looking at the margins, again, these are practices of feminism. It's bell hooks all over again, right? Of looking in the margins, of looking sideways, looking just off center in that photograph. We can see a range of ways in which feminisms in Africa have very radical roots. We also see, I want to argue what we see is also the containing and the taming of that radical impetus. And to grasp this intellectually, I draw on the idea of amenability that has been introduced by Claire Hemmings in her work on intellectual histories. She uses this word amenability to signal the ways in which radical stories and hopeful projects become discursively locked into narratives that are antithetical to the initial hopes or the imaginings of the actors, right? So amenability, for Hemmings, amenability is a lens that's different to thinking about radical projects as having been co-opted in history. So rather than a simplistic narration of feminist histories as being about a kind of linear trajectory of progress that hits a moment of loss and then gets, progress that leads to success, and then a whole range of gains that we map, and then setbacks and losses and co-optation. Rather than looking at it in that way, we might more productively consider how and when radical ideas are incorporated, sidelined, and defanged by more powerful movements, even by those movements who are in many respects the allies to feminist imaginings. Okay, this sounds very vague, so let me explore it in a little more detail, and let me do that by taking the term feminism itself, which, as you all know in this audience, I don't need to tell you, has always been a contentious word in Africa. So I want to put that term on the table and to discuss how amenability works to constrain the full articulation of the radical hopes and dreams of feminists in Africa. Now, that means I have to define feminism, of course, right? Because what am I talking about here? What is this word? So I have always defined feminism very broadly. I define it in this way as a theory and politics that challenges the gendered structures of power in society, economy, and politics. So the first part challenges gendered structures of power in all parts of our world. And the second part is that it articulates a democratic vision of society in which gender is not the basis for a hierarchy of power. So it's radically egalitarian, right, at its heart. This is a very capacious definition, And it's important that we have a capacious definition, given how many variants of feminisms there are in our theoretical arsenal, right? So it's a capacious definition. It doesn't presuppose rigid assumptions about the specific forms in which challenges may arise. So it doesn't give you a checklist by which you can say, this is truly feminist and that is not. It keeps it open. It doesn't predetermine which axes of power are more important. It doesn't say you must only challenge patriarchy in this way, and that if you're not overtly challenging what we deem to be patriarchal, you are not a true feminist, right? Those of you who know about the history of arguments between African feminists and other feminists, Southern feminists and other feminists, this is really an important thing. And it has emerged in open conflict in many conferences that we can think of. So I use this open definition also deliberately to disable the notion that there is a homogeneous and true feminism by which we can assess all other feminisms, that there is an original feminism or a model feminism that is the lodestar to which all feminisms must be measured and be aspiring towards. If we accept that feminist theories and feminist campaigns arise out of experiences of inequality, forms of oppression and suppression, then feminisms by their definition must be rooted in the varieties of societies we find themselves in. So difference is very much at the heart of my definition of feminism rather than a singular notion. And although a lot of academic theorizing may be far from life experience, I think life experience really does matter in the way we think about feminism. So as societies are shaped by these different configurations of power, the idioms and grammars of feminism also differ. But much of the work of fully articulating these differences has been very, very difficult. The conditions of knowledge production in our universities across the continent have hardly been conducive to debate and contestation. Women remain underrepresented. And unlike some parts of the world, women and gender studies programs, with very few exceptions, Makerere, the African Gender Institute at UCT, most others have really battled to survive in the face of hostility from managements, but also hostility to feminism from, I'm going to say, from our patriarchs in our midst. I'll come to that point again. Many of these academic programs have only survived because of conditional requirements to aid programs that have become part of international aid agencies, for example, have offered a route to bring financial resources into the university. So again, for our purposes in this audience, I don't need to elaborate the dead weight that consultancy work places on our thinking. And yet, I mean, of course, these consultancies have been ways to survive in the academy, right? But in a way, the dominance of consultancy type work, of the ways in which we've become across the continent, the providers of the empirical data for gender equality programming for international agencies, has reduced gender to a language of policy, to a language of formal equality, to a language of polite, if insistent, attention to how to include women in the existing arrangements of power. So, you know, ironically, gender as liberal feminism has triumphed on this continent. And I want to move away from that. You know, we could almost say, in looking at what's happened in the last 50 years in the trajectories of feminism in Africa, that our continent has produced feminism without feminists. How did that happen? Or feminists without feminism, we could say that too, right? And how did that happen? To say we were co-opted, though, I think is to lay the blame in the wrong places. At least to say that we were co-opted implies some kind of clear political direction that we were heading along, a path we were traveling on, that we were diverted from, that the path itself was right, but somehow we got shifted away from it. So I'm not sure anymore that that kind of explanation is helpful. But why do I say that it's feminism without feminists, feminists without feminism? How did those dynamics emerge? And hereby hangs a million tales, right? So to call oneself feminist is a political act, but political in what sense? You can't, you all know that feminism was a dirty word. It was the F word for many people in many movements in many parts of the continent. We had other kinds of words that people preferred to use. And the reasons why activists, what I would call feminist activists, you might want to ask me a question about the complexities of that. But let's just say for shorthand why feminists did not call themselves feminist. There are many reasons. There isn't a single reason for why African activists against gender exploitation didn't wear the term feminist. But does not mean that the ideas and the content of feminist activism did not exist in practice. For some activists, the choice was a strategic political one. You needed to build alliances with other political movements that were suspicious of feminists, and that strategic need overrode the concern with the linguistic register in which identities were forged, right? That's one type of reason that we might consider totally valid on the ground reasoning. For other people, it was safer to disavow the term feminist than to appear to align themselves with so-called Western feminism, right? Because it did not seem that Western feminism in that homogenized form, which I think is dangerous, and I don't think there is a homogeneous Western feminism, but it seemed to align itself with the imperialist elements that do exist in some forms of feminism, right? Mm-hmm. Not all forms of feminism were not imperialist. And so in that complexity, it was just easier to say, we're not feminists, we're something else. But back to my notion of amenability. When we decided not to use, in the places where we decided not to use that appellation of feminist, I think looking back now, however much it allowed us to make certain strategic gains, we paid a certain price for it. Because when words become out of bounds, or when words are misunderstood or misattributed, and we are not allowed the space to explore what that really means, they constrain how we might reimagine the world. So I want to say here that we actually owe a debt to the people who kept the word alive, who kept the word feminism alive, because the people who kept the word alive worked at the boundaries of what was possible. So, for example, I want to just note that we owe a debt to people like Ama-Ata Aidoo, who said, decades ago, said this: when people ask me bluntly every now and then whether I am a feminist, I not only answer yes, but I go on to insist that every woman and every man should be a feminist, especially if they believe that Africans should take charge of African land, African wealth, African lives. It is not possible to advocate independence for the African continent without believing that African women must have the best environment that can offer. That is the crux of feminism. So the debt we owe to Ama-Ata Aidoo and to others who shamelessly used the term in the face of everyone who said, that is not our term, that does not belong to us in Africa is that they allowed us to own feminism. They made it possible for some of us to refuse to cede the term feminism to the parochial and specific variant, say, that is second wave American feminism. So, in a way, I align myself with her because I think that what she is doing there is refusing to cede the power of making theory to the North, refusing to cede the creativity of political agency to narrowly defined sets of practices, and also refusing to cede to our comrades on the continent the power to define what is African and what is not. Okay. So we owe her a debt, but we do still have to deal with that difficult legacy of not being able to use the term, because it was, in retrospect, I think, a project of taming radical ideas, of making radical ideas amenable to projects that had greater power. Some of those projects were national and nationalistic. They proceeded from ideas of authenticity and nativism that relied on the control of women and women's bodies, that relied on the gender binaries of heterosexuality. So, for example, in development discourses, the language of gender paradoxically removed the notion that sex and sexualities were also structuring variables in our societies. In political discourses of nationalism, for example, where we made so many gains by centering women as political agents, but what we did and what we allowed was to center women as virtuous agents of movements. That is, that it's really clear in African political movements that women were very, very important, right? They were not invisible in African movements. They were, and they remain often the lever through which elitist nationalist movements became mass-based. It's through women that narrowly public middle-class movements enter into the spaces of families and households, cross into peasantries. It is in the memory-making work that women do that movements survive, right? So big gains, but the gain was to say that we will enter politics on virtuous terms. Let me explore that a little bit. To why I think that virtuous project, good women, that project of being good revolutionary women was to make ourselves amenable to a range of African patriarchal forms as well. So perhaps, the most central way in which this happened is that we begin to see in political projects the ways in which women become reduced to reproductive capacities, right? So here I'm thinking of the ubiquity of the notion that women's value lies in the fact that they are mothers of the nation. Now, again, I have to do a little bit of, clearing of the ground here. Of course, motherhood in Africa has never been an exclusively biological role. That the family forms across our continent, of course, have been rooted in shared and non-nuclear forms of organizing of labor, right? And of organizing of care and nurturing and so on. So there are very particular trajectories to the notion of motherhood that are different to the privatized forms of motherhood that were the basis of family forms, for example, in modernizing Europe, in the ways in which a nuclear family developed, and the ways in which some versions of feminism in Europe, for example, emerge in response to that push away of women into the private sphere. Those notions of public and private don't theoretically work in our contexts, where, you know, motherhood was not this closed off private, it was a public role, right? And anyone could be mother to anyone else. Any woman could be mother to anyone's children within a community. It was a mark of status and a mark of respect rather than a marker of invisibilization. We also have to acknowledge, of course, that in their actual struggles, women transformed motherhood into a basis of political action that was in many instances revolutionary. So by no means am I wanting to argue that motherhood and mothering are unimportant. But I also don't want to buy into the notion that these are quintessentially attached to female bodies. It's one thing to show, and many of us writing feminist histories have shown it, that women's political agency was facilitated by this gender division of labor. It was facilitated by the value placed on motherhood, right? And that women frequently used motherhood in radical and subversive ways. But it's completely another thing, theoretically, to mark motherhood as virtuously and distinctively the sole basis of women's agency, or the dominant basis of women's political agency. Because when we do that, we turn away from the politics of bodies that is rooted in the idea that women are also sexual and desiring beings, that those desires might be expressed in ways that are outside of the heterosexual norm, and that some women may not care to be mothers. Some women may not have the capabilities to be mothers, and that indeed women may have the status of persons independent of men, and may want to celebrate that. And that none of those possibilities is un-African, okay? And that we do not see that because we do not fully see those archives in which those dreams and hopes and aspirations were articulated within the valorized official archives. So we can see what effect this version of virtuous political agency, of feminism as motherhood politics, had in terms of being amenable to the ways in which societies were reorganized in the decolonizing period. For example, we can see this in discussions about work and care, right? So the culturalist arguments that are all over in many parts of Africa that feminists have had to come up against in a range of ways. I'm just going to take a couple of examples here. We can talk about others. We can talk about, one way in which we can talk about it is around land ownership and home ownership, right? And things like the laws in Uganda against spousal co-ownership of property in marriage, but there are many ways in which, but here I want to just take one example, and that is the culturalist argument that there's something distinctively African in the notion that individuals matter less than the community, that individuals individual interests must be subordinated to the interests of the community. So let's take, for those of us who are South African and familiar with this term, the concept of Ubuntu, right? Which some philosophers consider to be a quintessentially African notion of interdependence. A person is a person because of other people, okay? as an aside, when I used to teach redistributive politics and policies at Wits University, I used to say, actually, there's more Ubuntu expressed in Swedish social democracy in the period after the Second World War than anything we've seen expressed in post-apartheid South Africa, right? But that's a naughty aside. But take this concept, which clearly establishes the virtue of care in its strongest sense, because it defines care as the very quality of being human, right? So if I look at the work of the philosopher Mokgobe Ramose, who, he offers Ubuntu as an authentically African concept, one that is diametrically counterposed to Western individualism, and care, in his formulation, it's the responsibility of everyone, right? That's what Ubuntu means. We are all responsible for each other, for our collective well-being. This emphasis in Ubuntu debates, I think, aligns very well both with communitarian thinking about care, but also with certain feminist notions of care, in which care for feminists, we want to take it as a radical starting point, right? We want it to be, and there are lots of feminist schools of thought that want to proceed from an ethics of care rather than from a project of individual rights. So there's much to be gained from taking this notion of Ubuntu as the radical starting point for reimagining care. It appeals to notions, that are already imprinted in the languages and idioms of our societies in ways that are attractive, right? So any political project that wants to open a radical conversation will find the material there by using a notion such as Ubuntu. So if you want to talk about the value and the work of care, I think, yes, Ubuntu can be a really important indigenously rooted starting point. And let's assume, that in its most generous forms, the people who want us to work off that notion of Ubuntu are not talking about retreating to an idealized pre-capitalist, pre-colonialist past, right? So let's take the concept as a way for us to move forward in a way that will allow feminist concerns to be integrated into thinking about Ubuntu, into thinking about who bears the responsibility for care, because the continual enactment of care aligns with feminist theories, whether actually, and you can find it aligning with feminist theories of all sorts, liberal, socialist, and queer. In Black feminism, in decolonial feminism. So that notion of care and Ubuntu, right, I think it's productive. Let's go there and let's see where it has taken us and why I think this notion of amenability helps us to understand something odd that happened. We know that regardless of where the maldistribution of burdens of care come from, whether it comes from the colonialism, Christianity, or whether it comes from our own patriarchal past, independent of those of colonialism and capitalism. What we do know today in contemporary Africa, care is not equally distributed. It's not equally distributed in terms of who provides it, nor in terms of who receives it, right? So let's radically reimagine who will share those burdens. So then if I go to the archives of Ubuntu, I actually find very little that will help me to do that. Very little that will help me to take it in a radical and feminist direction, where the radicality of the decolonial philosophers will overlap with the radicality of African feminisms. But rather what we find in the discussions of care is that actually these communalist arguments have overlapped with neoliberal arguments, that they've been amenable to the idea that the public should be removed from discussions of care, that those arguments of the community must come above the individual have been used to justify the lack of support for socialized programs of care and for the lack of redistribution of material resources in order to make the burdens of care more equally borne by everybody in society. As feminist critiques of structural adjustment programs across Africa have shown so very clearly, the emphasis on strengthening the family and community has left open the question of who in the family and the community ought to be responsible for undertaking care work. You can put care within the family because it is African. You can say it's un-African that our people, old people, should be cared for in care homes. And that sounds right, because we do not, I think, in our radical reimagining of society, want to see prison-like institutionalization of people who need care. But that becomes a gloss over the power relations within the family. It obscures the ubiquitous male power to command women's labor. So the unexamined use of the term Ubuntu can simply become jargonistic. It can establish some identitarian credentials, but it actually fails to address questions of power internal to communities as well as between communities. And we know that throughout our continent, groups of people may be treated as unworthy of care from both state and families. We saw that in the AIDS crisis. We see that in the way in which queer people are dependent on resources only within queer communities because it's so hard to find support outside of it, right? In particular, I think for those of us in South Africa, we see it in the high rates of gender-based violence. Another example that could be proffered to show that Ubuntu is not an innate quality, but a virtue that needs to be actively cultivated among us, right? And that we have to cultivate it using all of our new radical tools. From the perspective of women, as Pumla Kolap shows us so lucidly in her work, Rape, a Feminist Nightmare, and the Female Fear Factory, families and communities can be violent and even deadly spaces. There's no use in pretending that that is not so. Touting Ubuntu without carrying through its implications then into public funding, into changing practices within the private sphere, and specifically for reducing and redistributing burdens across generations and genders, I think denudes it of its value for discussions of care politics. Let me take one other example to make my point, in case you are not yet convinced. Let me offer another example where our shared commitments to liberation and to revolutionary thinking have ended up in disabling women, right? Take the really important politics of opposing white savior politics that positions white women as defenders of the human rights of brown and black women, right? Let's take Spivak's formulation of humanitarianism as being white women saving brown women from brown men, right? In all forms of feminism in Africa, we have opposed that impulse in a certain variance of Western feminism, right? I mean, we know this. Histories of colonization have very clearly introduced different axes of power, A, and B, made us alert to the ways in which colonial projects are racialized and position African men in ways that are deeply exploitative and I don't want to use the word emasculating, but you know what I mean, that kind of reduces their humanness, that reduces that treats Black men as voraciously sexual and rapists, right? And so feminists in Africa have always resisted the notion that somehow you have to align with this particular notion of feminism in which we have to be protected from the men we live with, and therefore have to, that patriarchy has to be placed as a system above other systems. Rather, we have always said that racism, colonialism, and capitalism intersect with and mutually constitute patriarchy. Okay, so we've refused, in the ways in which we've thought about what we want out of feminism, to engage in projects of carcerality for sexual violence, for one example, refused to collude with the demonization of Black masculinities, and to resist this notion of disentangling gender from other axes of power. Have our male allies reciprocated? Well, a new generation of Black feminists across the continent is not convinced. They are beginning to challenge the male left, to suggest that too much of the archive of Blackness has focused on the suffering of Black men in particular. In some readings, let me just throw out one that you may not have encountered. The radical thinker in South Africa, Motherhood, Manzi, she argues, and this is a quote, "The very conception of freedom for the Black community is articulated as the restoration of a lost Black manhood, in addition to other forms of loss suffered by Blacks, such as the loss of land and labor. In the archives, the real targets of racism and its attendant violence are presented as Black heterosexual men, while the narratives of Black people who do not fit this identity occupy the margins." This is still her words. "It may be tempting to suggest, for instance, that when Black consciousness movement leader Steve Biko says the first step towards building Black solidarity is to make the Black man come to himself, to pump life back into his empty shell, to infuse him with pride and dignity, he was only hamstrung by a foreign language in which he had to settle for approximations of what he really meant. However, this recurrence of the centralization of Black men suffering throughout Black liberation movements warrants analysis. What is it that would compel author and civil rights movement activist James Baldwin to claim from the other side of the world that the only real crime is to be a Black man? Okay, that is a very extensive quote from Rebazi Manzi, but I wanted to give you a real flavor of these suppressed radical challenges, because I think that challenge, however we want to respond to it, right? And I'm not telling you how we should respond to it. I grapple with it. It deserves to be grappled with. It is a significant challenge, and it is echoed across many arenas of queer politics. It's this erasure of, in her words, Black women's pain, and I'm using the word pain here deliberately, as Rebazi Manzi's discourse, as well as the discourse of the young fallist feminists, of the Black queer feminists, is a discourse in which pain is used to signal that discrimination has real visceral effects on self, and that this idea of pain frames the concept of intersectionality. That's a term, as you know, that has displaced triple oppression as the linguistic marker of in African feminist debates. And I, as an old feminist, I've been trying to understand why that term carries more purchase, so much more purchase, this term that comes from American theorizing. Why is it so attractive? And why has it displaced our indigenous theoretical terminology? But the more I think about it, the more I think that this discursive shift signals something deeper. It signals a rejection of the politics of respectability and motherhood that accompanied the theorizing of women's liberation, the women's question, those old idioms of feminism. And it's given greater discursive power by the fact that it is rooted in Black women's theoretical archives, not in the theoretical archives of white feminism or in the theoretical archives of Black male struggle. Moreover, because of its association with feminism, intersectionality as a concept, I think, signals a certain openness to Black women's leadership that has not been there before. These young people who are making these arguments are often in our public spaces disproportionately gay, transgender, or otherwise queer. They are boundary breakers in multiple ways, and they are, I would say, they are of course products of earlier queer and feminist politics, but they are also something that is distinctively new. They are building on a foundation in conceptual terms of post-colonial feminism. They are building on the post-colonial feminist arguments for gender and sexuality to be addressed as structuring variables in analysis and not simply as epiphenomena of colonialism and capitalism. They are building on the ways in which in the 80s and the 90s, colonialism and capitalism centered the ways in which we began to put those terms on the table, both at the level of the nation state as well as vis-a-vis empire writ large, and that those processes of making new subjectivities that occurred in the decolonization era, what post-colonial feminists showed was that they were profoundly repressive and violent. Post-colonial feminists also critiqued liberal feminisms that were associated with modernization theory, showing how those modernizing nationalisms really were tied to attempts to identify women not as full agents, but simply as the most oppressed, and that was it, right? So there is a history behind this new radical politics, but there's also something that is, I think, distinctively new, that visibilizes the ways in which sexuality, gender, race, and class mutually constitute each other in the formation of subjectivities, as well as positioning people in the economic hierarchy. And I haven't had enough time to talk about the economy, but we should. So it is in particular, I think, a lexicon which we have seen emerging in the last 5 years, in which what is being challenged is not only colonial power, it's not only the economic power of capitalists, but also radical male-centered power within, for example, Black consciousness movements. We can find examples from the Rhodes Must Fall and Peace Must Fall movements to bear this out. But I've already hitting up against the 60 minutes I was granted. So I want to end by saying that these discursive and political shifts among young feminists in the continent really give life to me as an old feminist. There is something in the air. There is something new afoot. There's something in young people's refusal, even in the refusal to be called women, right? But the refusal to be polite, the willingness to offend, the unashamed and open occupation of the public space that makes me hopeful for the futures of African feminism. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much, Sherini. That was a generous offering, and you troubled a lot of thinking in Africa. And now I will hand over to Bongani to take us through the question and answer.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Shirin. It was wonderful. So we open it up, colleagues, for questions, comments, conversation. You can raise your hand, virtual hand, or write your comments and questions in our chat. So we can start. We have about 1 hour for a conversation. Thank you very much.
I'm just getting my notebook.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Okay, I'm here. Just want to make sure I take notes as people speak.
Okay, so good for the first questions, comments. So, check here. Oh. Oh, that's quite a, I don't know, I don't know whether you can see, we have on the comments quite a long question. Perhaps we should start there. So I'll just try to read quickly. It says, can you say something about the work of critique that the orientation of genealogies of feminism offers us? Two questions in particular. Whether we feminists lose something by emphasizing theoretical analytics of power that center the ontology of power. And while this is useful, is there not an unintended consequence of arriving at formulations of power that are final? I mean, for example, Black feminism, African feminism, decolonial feminism. And the second part, and so a feminist de-theorizing project rather, help us arrive at formulations of power that are in fact not final? Should we not rather engage with analytic grounds that help us critique aspects of powers, operational logic and force? I don't know whether you can address that while we'll read other questions after.
That's a very astute question piece, because what you've picked up is my my ambivalence in a way, you know, that on the one hand, when I say genealogies, I want to gesture to difference and contingency and to debate, right? But at the same time, the minute we begin to do any kind of categorization, we end up organizing around some rather homogenizing concepts. And I mean, what I try to do is to, and I think all theorization entails a certain kind of loss, because it can never be total, right? Or you're always saying this is more important than something else. Beginning from and you're also picking up, I think, a tension that I haven't fully worked through, in that I want to say, let's move to archives that are outside of the written theoretical archives and look at archives that are in action, in practice, in culture, and in song. And I haven't fully offered up those examples. So I'm going to immediately concede that that is a potential problem with the ways in which the term genealogy could be taken. But I think genealogical projects are deeply rooted in the notion, are also deeply rooted in the notion that power is not that power is localized and diffuse, aren't they? Isn't the genealogy term signaling that in some sense? So I'm happy to have this as a back and forth piece, so that you can say more clearly what you're thinking there. Because I don't want to say there is an African feminism. I don't want to say there is, even like when I did my first book, it's just now nearly 2 decades ago. My God, I feel old. But there I identified 5 different variants of feminism in South Africa, right? all of which have a right to call themselves feminists, but in which there are distinctions between them, differences. So I don't think that genealogies stops us from recognizing that.
Okay. So there is a question from Frida. She says the question is small. What do you see in terms of the scope for transnational feminist solidarity building in South Africa today, in the face of both the hunger to reclaim African lineages scholarship and a right-wing populism that expresses itself in xenophobia?
I think we are in an intensely transnational moment, actually, and that anything that we kind of assumed was very specific and parochial to us quite clearly is not, right? So the rise in right-wing populism, it may have some distinctive forms in South Africa, but actually all across the world, there is a rise in a kind of politics that is, the people that if Susan Faludi called it backlash politics, but that doesn't really capture it, but in which, for example, there's an anti-feminist populism, right, across the world that is not simply, it's not something that, oh my goodness, South Africa is worse than anywhere else. It's happening in Eastern Central Europe. It's happening in the dismantling of the provisions for abortion. And it's happening in South Africa, and the ways in which people are beginning to talk about it. There's a wonderful thing about social media, which everybody loves to hate, but actually there are new forms of publics that are being created as spaces in which those can be talked about. There's a lovely paper actually by someone I once taught at Tunai. You can ask me for that reference later, Srila, in which he talks about how, in the context of a lack of safety for queer people, queer immigrants, particularly in Germany, these digital spaces allow new kinds of publics to emerge, and they allow solidarity to be built across a whole range of spaces, right? They have also allowed us to see how central to this right-wing discourse at the beginning of the 21st century, how central disabling feminism is. Disabling the idea that women are persons with the rights, the re-entry into our debates about questions like abortion, right? We're beginning to see it in African debates. We're beginning to see, just do a Google search for the most recent papers around abortion, and you'll be absolutely astounded to find how many of them are making arguments for why abortion does not accord with African moral philosophy, right? Even though we know historically that, abortifacients are part of indigenous knowledge systems across Africa, and that midwives have held this knowledge for a very, very long time, which suggests it must have been practiced for a very, very long time. So transnational feminist solidarity building is happening all over the world. I know that there are young feminists that are working across geographic boundaries to articulate what those possibilities might look like. Unsurprisingly, you're much more likely to find solidarities that are framed as solidarities around being Black feminists than being African feminists, although I think African lineages of feminism do matter in those discussions. But, the common experience of being racialized and gendered is the basis for that. you know, and some would argue, and you know this literature as well as I do, that the fallist movement in South Africa was at the forefront for a new transnational politics that is, you know, anti-xenophobic, anti-sexist, anti the idea of that is part of right-wing discourses of returning to the importance of the family, right? So the return of the notion of the importance of community and family, we can see so closely mirrored between Eastern Europe and Southern Africa. We can find those resonances where it is used to disable radical arguments, where we have to be careful of the extent to which we become amenable to those projects, because we are trying to resist the hierarchies of Western power, capitalist power, and so on. I don't know if that sort of goes some way to answering it, but it seems to me this is a question for all of us as well, right? It's a big question, not a small question.
Thank you. See, there is a comment from Prabna, in which she says she agrees that there are new forms of publics emerging that are debunking beliefs and ideas not only across disciplines, but commonly held beliefs in our everyday spaces. I don't know whether you would like to comment on that, Cheryl.
Yeah, thanks. I agree. I mean, obviously, you know, we agree. And there are many. I mean, I just like tying it to the earlier question that Srila asked. Yeah, you know, I think about communities of care and the ways in which you think about care, right? There are also articulations of transnational care and caring that seem interesting to me, and you know, that we can track on social media. Spaces of quite real solidarity that are easier to engage in than the conventional political movements.
Thank you. Just maybe before I read the other question, maybe just one practice. Can you perhaps expand on your thoughts on the North-South binaries that you touched on earlier on in the talk? Then we'll read the other question.
Okay, thanks. Yes, so I skimmed over that, but I guess what I mean is something quite commonsensical, that there is no such thing as a homogeneous North and a homogeneous South, right? That when you actually look at what this thing is that is called Western feminism, usually what people mean when they say Western feminism, what they mean is liberal feminism, or they mean second wave feminism. But in fact, there are a variety of feminisms across Europe, across North America. Socialist feminism for example, has very rich history and very rich set of traditions, and was always fighting against liberal feminism, or fighting against second wave feminism, and socialist feminism was always intersectional, because it always wanted to think about class and gender, and then race, class, and gender. Similarly, the West is not homogeneously white. There are many Black people that are Western, that have always lived in the West, that are no less belonging to Europe, say, than white people belong to Europe. And those groups of people have been making claims and theorizing their lives and articulating forms of feminism, for as long as we can trace back ideas. But more recently, for example, in the trajectories of feminism, I'm reminded again of how important it was to South African feminist thinking, the work of groups like Southern Black Sisters in London was, because they were beginning to offer a language of race that was interesting and useful. And you could say the same of the United States. Why do we think American feminism is white feminism? Who are we evacuating from being part of the histories of feminism there? So I find that term too homogenizing. I also feel like it completely writes out the spaces where feminists gathered together and thought as in contestation with each other, but also as comrades about ideas. You might want to think, for example, about the Nairobi conference in 1985, where you had feminists from across the world coming together, and where one of the axes of difference was the women who were in the non-aligned movement, who began to articulate a language in the UN space in which it is, in which they challenged the idea that economic questions should not be brought into the purview of what we call feminist questions, right? It was not about gender. So that was a form of theorizing in which across the non-aligned movement, so that was across particularly Indian and African feminists, but also where socialist feminists from Eastern Europe were involved in that conversation. So there's this movement of ideas that I think is completely, we just throw it all out when we do this homogenizing of North and South. And I could say a whole lot about the South and how it is also not homogeneous, and where there are also hierarchies of thought, hierarchies of power in terms of access to university spaces and theorization and so on, that also make us not, a homogeneous grouping. So that's why I want to push against those binaries. I just do not think that people think and act and struggle and resist in these clear silos as North-South seems to imply.
Thank you, Shiri. We have a couple of questions, and starting from one from a participant from India, who's asking about similarities between the form of patriarchal structure in Africa and India. And she said, in particular in India, the caste system managed to maintain a discourse of exploitation between higher caste men and higher caste women, but also the same way of exploitation between lower caste men and women. So the question is, where can we find a dual level of exploitation over more inferior caste women from the upper and lower caste men? Is there the same way of exploitation that can be seen between Black women and white or Black men?
Thank you very much. Oh, that's such a difficult question. I don't know the name of the person who posed it. It comes up as Office, but thank you for that question. And I'm not enough of an expert, and I'm trying to understand. There is a debate about race as caste as race, as Isabel Wilkerson's book really opened that conversation up for us in a very interesting way. I don't feel completely equipped to say something decisive over that, but I do think what is interesting in your question, where I do see similarities, are that because of these intersecting forms of inequality, a simplistic politics of men versus women was never viable in Africa, as it, I think, was not viable in many from my reading, often was not viable in India either, because colonialism did have the kinds of impacts that it did. So I don't want to say there's equivalence here. I think there's the general idea I take out of it is that gender works in and through other forms of exploitation that may be geographically, historically specific. And we have to grasp all of those forms. And there's almost, there's a very, very minimal trace of the idea that feminism is about men versus women, at least in the South African conversation, and certainly more broadly on the continent. It can't be because so much of our experience of the world is a shared experience with men, right? And that's not as simple as men versus women.
Thank you, Shireen. We should take the question from Iretemi Obolade. It says, how would you describe the separatism ideology among African feminists when in fact the African continent is not monolithic? And also, would you rather advise that African feminism insists more on universal characterization in place of a superimposed Western definition, and instead of withdrawing from it and bent on sticking to culture and categories of definition, considering contextualization is a great contestation of African feminism? And she says she would be happy if you can elaborate on the North and South dichotomy, which we have already addressed.
Yeah, thank you very much, Renitemi. I wonder if I could just for a moment engage you in this. So when you say separatist ideology, what do you mean? Are you meaning that we shouldn't work with Western feminists, that version of separatism? Or I'm not sure which version of separatism it is that you are referring to. I mean, there are many forms of separatist politics, and I don't have an in principle objection to separatism. I mean, I think very often in political movements, you have the creation of these spaces that are considered safe for the elaboration of tensions and differences. And I don't personally find those to be threatening or problematic. So that form of separatism, seems to me strategic and contingent. And it usually, those attempts to create spaces that are separate and closed off are spaces for regrouping, so that you re-enter politics with a clearer set of ideas, or feeling stronger, or feeling more but there's also other kinds of separatism, the lesbian separatism, which won't ever work with men. So I'm not entirely sure which type of separatism you're referring to there, and you should certainly feel free to come back on what it is you mean there. Does African feminism insist more on universal characterization in place of a superimposed Western definition? What does it? First of all, again, African feminism feels too homogenizing. So to respond to that, I would rather say, do these particular movements or authors want to, say we withdraw from Western? I don't think there's a singular Western definition, by the way. I think there are, I think that as I said, with Southern Black sisters, or as I said, you would know, with the relationships between, that go back a long way, between women from Africa traveling to the United States and finding common cause with Black activists. So, in that sense, they're engaging with the West. but they're engaging in a different way with the West, right? So I don't want to take Black women in London to not be Western. I don't want to take African American people to not be Western, but we can argue that. I know that not everyone would agree. Do we stick to culture? Well, I think every feminism contends with culture. Every feminism contends with context, right? Because how does patriarchy articulate itself? How does it find meaning and expression? It is in the practices between people, and we call those practices culture. So I don't think that in Africa we're any more attached to culture than anyone else. We're all dealing with these everyday practices and meaning-making strategies.
Thank you. We should move to the question by Nombulelo, which is about the hesitance of African feminists calling themselves feminists. And she says these tend to be more traditionalist women or people. This resistance can tend to create conflict between these two more traditionalist women who still do important care work and those who are more unapologetic about their feminism and want to disrupt the respectability politics. So, and she asks, how do you remedy this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't, so those the people who did not want to call themselves feminists, I think they're fewer and fewer, by the way, right now. I think there are generational shifts, but they're more recent generational shifts. I think not all of the women who didn't want to call themselves feminist in the 60s, 70s, and 80s were traditionalist. They were in their practices and ambitions, I would say, quite feminist. So what I want to push against, I mean, I don't think it's helpful to get into, accusatory politics of who is a feminist and who is not a feminist. That's not the intention behind it. But I think what I was trying to get at there is that when we are unable to really use terms, and when certain terms some group of people decides this is not African, in the way that they say, oh, well, homosexuality is not African, that is a disabling move, right? So we should articulate the messiness of feminism. We should put all these different approaches on the table. And instead of doing that in a context of accusatory point and counterpoint, we should be doing it to get us towards greater understanding rather than relabeling per se. But I think that because for so long we just did not want to explore the theoretical dimensions of feminism, but rather wanted to kind of evade it, perhaps in academic work, by talking about the actual things people do, which is quite right. But we have, I think, held ourselves back from making the kind of radical theoretical interventions that we are able to from the complexities of our experiences on the continent. And they don't find, they're not finding their way into these other debates. And in a paper that Srila Roy gave on Monday at WISA, she made the point that it seems so much easier. She asked, why is it so much easier for scholars based in India, she was saying, to turn to the literature that is coming out of the US or the UK rather than literature that is coming out of African spaces. And I think part of the answer there lies in the extent to which we have not been able to fully put our ideas out into these spaces. Just a shout out here for a moment to the many attempts in which the many theory building attempts where people were trying to do this. I'm thinking about the gender seminars in Codesria and the gender workshops, right? Which were hard fought for by earlier feminists like Fatou Sow and Amina Mama and so on. You know, yeah, somebody will write the history of those contestations and the kind of fights between women, between feminists and masculinists within Codesria. Those stories are yet to be told, but I think we're getting there. I think people are writing now and they're putting it out, and you know, so I'm quite hopeful.
Thank you. I think that was the last question that we had. I don't know if somebody can take it back to you just to conclude, and thank Sharon. You are muted. Yes.
There was a hand which was up, but
Yes.
it has disappeared.
Yes, no, I think maybe it's network problems. I cannot see the hand. Yeah.
Okay. If there are no more questions, we don't want to overkeep Prof. Hasim here. He has given us a lot to think about, and you can tell it from the questions it provoked. So it was well received, and people are digesting it. I took copious notes myself, and it helped me a lot. And thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for dedicating time to participate in our series. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks. I wouldn't mind actually if these questions the chat could be saved, because I think these are really, really good questions, and I certainly want to think about them more than I was able to respond to here. So if you don't
just one
mind.
question, Shirin,
Yeah.
before we conclude, from Melissa.
Yeah.
I don't know if we can just take that, before we conclude. And she says she's concerned with the project of decoloniality and decolonial feminist theories and methodologies, which is also located in the geopolitical paradigm of the global north. What would you advise someone in that position on how to deal with not falling into the trap of reproducing colonial and homogenizing binaries and extractive practices when writing about the different forms and perspectives of diverse Western and African feminisms? Oh, yes, and the hand, perhaps, so that you can take both questions, the hand is back. Munyarazi, let's give you the platform to ask your question.
Thank you, Wongani. I had been kicked out because of load shedding. I think this is the experience that we all know, especially in South Africa these days. So, but at least I managed to get connected again, to the main power line. Thank you, Shireen, for genealogies of feminism in Africa, which is not necessarily genealogies in the conventional way. And I think I liked the approach. I think I liked the way you tried to problematize that. But I would like to understand, maybe from your point of view, in terms of Linda Alcoff's terminology, his categorization of feminism as imperial feminism and missionary feminism. Where would you place this? And in terms of the genealogies that are not necessarily genealogies in the manner in which you have given us this presentation. So that's one. And then two.
Munyarazi, can you say a little more clearly missionary feminism? What are you referring to specifically there? Is that the savior feminism from the West, or do you literally mean our own, for example, Southern Africa, the women who became Christian missionaries? I just want to be clear.
Not necessarily from the way Linda problematizes it. I think when she talks of, missionary feminism, it's probably this whole idea of probably trying to say, let us assist probably
yes,
women who are in need. Probably they need, stoves rather than using firewood and stuff. But then it's some kind of feminism which is then abused, if I can call it that way, in the name of some kind of probably missionary work. So I don't know how you would handle that. And then the second question I have is, I don't know whether you may be able to tell us probably what you may say or what you can see as the strongest link or strongest point of feminism for feminist scholarship, and its weakest link or its weakest point, because I would just like to counterpose those two and just have an understanding in terms of, what are its, strongest links or points and what are its weakest links. Thank you.
Well, these are such amazing questions. Missionary feminism. Let me say a couple of things in relation to that. The first is that we shouldn't. We should remember that practically all women's movements that we know of have begun with have been rooted in some kind of missionary type, not Christian or religious missionary type of work, but in some ways in the kind of somewhat conservative, let me say, impulse. So, a lot of women's movements around the world are rooted in temperance. Women who wanted to control the extent to which men were drinking alcohol. In fact, in New Zealand, women won the right to vote by using arguments from temperance movements about women's capability to make decisions over men's capability to make decisions. So women's movements often do have these roots in women's attempts to control and kind of control male violence or a male lack of responsibility towards their children and so on. In the 20th century, we see across the continent a lot of politics of uplift, right? That women are at the forefront of a politics of uplift, that we'll rise our communities up, we'll do good social work, that will be the ways in which our communities will deal with a range of social ills that come out of the fractures produced by the economy, by colonial power relations, and so on. So those forms of missionary, if you want to call it politics, our own versions of uplift, are very much part of our history. And I'm not being judgmental about it, because I think to understand why that happens, we have to understand the gendered structure of responsibility in patriarchal societies, right? That women are the ones who are left with the burden of care. And so it comes out of their gendered responsibility for reproduction that they take on these roles. And as far as they go, they're fine. I think of the work on the ANC, even when it was in exile. Women were the social workers of the movement for the exiled liberation movements. Okay, so that's as far as it goes. It is what it is. But a lot of uplift is simply about creating respectable families rather than creating families in which everybody is harmoniously happy. Yesterday in a seminar with Atambile Masola, who has done some work on Charlotte Maxeke, for example, pointed out that Charlotte Maxeke we respect, we celebrate as a mother of the nation, etc., right? But actually, a lot of her work was about making women respectable. And a lot of what she was articulating would not be accepted by young feminists today as being particularly feminist. That's not to diss her. That's not to say what she did was totally unimportant, so much as to map the trajectories of these different kinds of politics. What are the strongest points and the weakest points? I mean, the strongest points of feminisms in Africa is that they always grasped and tried to articulate and explain the notion of intersectionality long before intersectionality became the word that it is today, right? And I lament the fact that we don't recognize our own roots to that word. But that, because in some ways, the Kimberly Crenshaw, initial formulation of intersectionality was a parochial response to the parochial ways in which the law worked in the United States. We had a much more radical and broad-ranging understanding of intersectionality across the continent because of our experiences of colonialism. So, and there are many ways in which that found expression. We disabled much of liberal feminism's foundational ideas in the kind of feminism that was being articulated in Africa. For example, the one I pointed to earlier about the clear divide between public and private. I don't think African feminists ever operated with that notion. They were always contesting it. They were always pointing out the ways in which colonial power found itself perfectly able to intervene very directly in the lives, in the very private lives of Black people, right, across the continent, of the colonized people. I think, so those are all strong points for me. What are its weakest points? I think in a sense, because perhaps there's a notion of being embattled, which comes out in some of the questions, right? That embattled, facing some kind of Western feminist behemoth. There's often too much defensiveness, too little, possibly too little hospitality to the ideas, to ideas that don't necessarily fall into place. It's hard to say. So, I mean, for example, I keep coming back to this question of motherhood and what we do with it. And I look at the range of ways in which we were prevented, some feminists, including me, prevented from properly talking about what is lost and gained by using feminism as our motherhood as the dominant frame, right? And we had well-meaning white Western feminists who wanted to be allies to the African women's movements, who pushed out any discussion that was critical of the motherhood framing, or pushed out conversations that were critical of nationalism. But that doesn't mean they weren't there. So I think perhaps defensiveness, I don't know, Munyaradzi, does that capture it? Too much defensiveness. I'd like to see more assertiveness and more claiming of space for the ideas that are there. And I think the obstacles are put in place, not only, we're very used to this, the kind of blaming the North, blaming the West, and there are also other obstacles that come from our own spaces and the people we think are our allies, who will readily tell us feminism. Still, these feminist ideas are not African. They'll still tell us that. They'll still tell us that it's white people's thinking, that we shouldn't talk about violence against women. And you read Pumla's work, for a long time, you couldn't talk about rape and violence against women. And then when it was raised in the public sphere, Thabo Mbeki said, oh, it's these white feminists making trouble again. They just want to demonize Black men. Well, I think we were too defensive in response to that. Or I should say, I think that the generations before were too defensive. I don't think there is that much defensiveness now.
Thank you, Shireen. There is a question by Melissa.
Right, Melissa. What a good question. What a difficult question to answer. How do we not fall into the traps of these? I think partly we have to shift from, I'm going to say this to Sabelo as well, Sabelo, my interlocutor on decoloniality in several seminars. Sabelo, I feel like we have to stop critique and we have to start making, if that makes sense. We have to take our work away from generalized critiques into showing how our theorizing makes a difference, how theorizing of phenomena as they appear to us. I specifically wanted to use the example of care because I wanted to show how that has, that we are faced with a real crisis of care and a crisis of social reproduction in most of Africa. And that we have not been able to fully deal with that because the best work on dealing with the crisis of social reproduction actually comes from feminist thinking, but feminist thinking has not been drawn upon, is not considered useful. So one way to get away from the West versus the rest and so on is that more and more feminists have to take up the actual problems that we are facing in these different societies and bring our theoretical skills to bear in relation to the core complexities, labor, the core complexity, violence, right? The core complexity. We could talk about what do we actually want? How do we want to use public resources in all of those spaces? I think we would engage in a different kind of conversation that's different to engaging in a West versus the rest kind of argument, and that we will actually show the sharpness of our theoretical tools. That I want to say is it's not just that debates about policy are not just debates about policy. They're also debates about the kinds of futures we imagine for our societies, right? We talk about electricity shortages and load shedding. Well, how are women maintaining households in the face of this? I can bet you that it's the women who are having to decide how they're going to get the supper cooked, in addition to how they are going to get to work and back, right? But those are not the questions that come up. So I just want us to have a debate about our own societies and, let other countries have the debates about their societies. We can share ideas, but we must return to the local in some ways.
Okay, thank you, Shireen. There is a last question from Irene. And she asks, how do you answer if a student point blank says feminism isn't African? Or what is the point of feminism? Do you answer in an introductory way, a collaborative way, not over theoretical, but also not overly anecdotal and interpersonal?
Yeah. Oh, well, I spent my life teaching feminism and sometimes calling it feminism, sometimes, with a fig leaf title for the course. But so I know exactly the kind of problem that you are raising. People do still say that. Students, of course, they say that it isn't African, and students, I think, have to be engaged not as antagonistic. In other words, we should not assume that it comes from a place of antagonism, but rather assume that it comes from a place of limited reading or misunderstanding. And, you know, what I've always done as a strategy, a pedagogical strategy in such situations is to ask, what do you think feminism is? What do you think being African is? What do you attach under those labels? Who is included under those labels? And the minute you begin to open up those questions, you know, you might end up with a situation, oh, but I still don't want to call it feminism, but okay. You know, of course, I do think that women should have control over their lives, or whatever it is. I don't think it helps to respond in a way that is a kind of, you don't know anything at all. I'm sure you don't respond in that way. And we do have to ask, like the student asking, why do we do these things to each other? That is a very good question, isn't it? I want to know why do we hurt each other in the ways we hurt each other? And there are now resources being built up for us to answer those questions. Kopano Ratele's book on African masculinities, which, by the way, we'll be discussing in a seminar I'm organizing in a couple of months. But Kopano Ratele asks exactly that question: why do we hurt each other? Where does this impetus to harm come from? And how far does it take us to say, well, we just have this is the result of the past? Where do our own complicities begin and end? And I mean all of us, right? And not just men. You know, Kopano's answer is deeply human. It's about how we all relate to each other. Why do mothers socialize boys in particular ways too? We have to ask all of those questions. And I think the question, why do we do things to each other, is a profound starting point for all kinds of debates. I like that question.
Thank you so much.
It requires making ourselves vulnerable. Maybe that is and that means us as teachers as well, right? Making ourselves vulnerable to the answers that lie there, to the multiplicity of answers, some of which implicate us in those practices. Sorry, Bongani, I'm done.
No, that's been wonderful. Sabelo,
yeah, in fact, there was a practical issue which Shireen raised about getting these questions. Is there a way you can capture them?
Oh, I think I managed to do it. I have saved chat, so I hope it saves it somewhere on my computer, and I'll look for it, because the quality of the questions was just superlative.
And I think they tell us that critique is still important.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you had to get the last one in there.
The seminar is also recorded, Shireen. Just make sure you get there. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Shireen. We have really enjoyed this discussion, and I think the questions really are an expression of that. You raised the key issues which are troubling us on a daily basis, both in the academy and in society. So I could see them really strangling those two spheres in a very interesting way. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
And the next seminar, by the way, is on the 20th of October. By Edwin, the Executive Secretary of CODESA.
Sure.
Yes. I think the title is Reconfiguring African Studies. That is the title of Godwin Murunga's next Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Be well.
Great. Thank you, Shireen.
Sure.
I'm going to go now.
Sure. Thanks, Shireen. We'll get in touch.
Yeah, we'll be in touch. Good.
Sure.
I want to hear updates. I want to hear some updates from you. Okay, good.
Sure.
Okay, bye.
Bye.